So we talked about how ethical relativism, which is the view that what counts as right or wrong depends on who you are, is based on a basic ethical observation that cultures disagree broadly on ethical issues. Now, I'm talking about cultures here. There are two versions of ethical relativism. There's subjectivism, which is the view that what counts as right or wrong is actually relative to you. It's relative to each individual's perspective. The more common version of relativism, you could call it conventionalism or cultural relativism, is the view that ethical truth is relative to what culture you belong to. So that's the sort of version that I'm going to be referencing by default. But you should know that there are those two versions of ethical relativism. Excuse me, gosh, rude. Okay, so I hope we kind of understand why the view is plausible. I'm sure that actually many of you probably feel like you have you identify with with relativism because of that basic observation of the differences in culture and maybe a desire that you have to be tolerant of other ethical viewpoints. And that does that connection with that observation does make ethical relativism attractive. However, it's interesting to point out that the field of ethics is mostly dominated by people who identify with objectivism, which is the sort of opposite of relativism. Objectivism is the view that there's either a single moral principle or a set of moral principles which is objectively true. And that means true for everybody across all time. So, okay, well, if relativism is as attractive as I've said it is, then why is it the case that so many of these philosophers that we're going to read in this class disagree with relativism? Well, while relativism has this attractive quality to it of tolerance, it also has some serious problems associated with it. One of the reasons that we study ethics is because ethical knowledge, ethical judgment, and understanding is so important and visceral to us. And often that comes to us in the form of an intense or visceral or very just strong conviction of the wrongness of certain kinds of actions. Now, there are differences between cultures that are not so extreme, and those are cases where we might think that tolerance is warranted. So, for instance, in another culture, they might believe that it's wrong to eat the flesh of cows. It's true in some cultures. Now, that's an ethical disagreement between our cultures, but you might think of that disagreement, well, there's disagreement there, but I say, live and let live. It's not that big a thing for me to give up that argument. I'm happy for them to go about following their own ethical practices. But if you look at a sort of a radical example of a cultural disagreement, you could look at something like the Third Reich in Germany in the 30s, leading to Nazism in World War II, where a culture practiced heinous ethical practices, and they weren't going against their own ethical principles. They had clear, well-defined ethical principles, which involved pursuing practices of mass genocide, mass murder. So there's an extreme case of ethical disagreement. Now, it's easy to sort of give up the ethical disagreement when it comes to eating beef, but when it comes to genocide, or when it comes to other important ethical principles, like don't harm innocent people needlessly, don't abuse powerless people. Well, these very strong ethical principles, these things that seem to us to be very obviously wrong, if ethical relativism is true, we don't actually have any grounds for criticizing that behavior, because within the culture that it was occurring in, it was acceptable. Now, the relativist, you can form a more nuanced version of relativism that has responses to these sorts of things, but this is a big problem for relativism. It also makes things like social progress difficult to understand. So you might think that maybe we certainly don't live in a perfect society, but if you compare the society of today to the society that was here 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, you might be of the opinion that there has been significant progress made. For instance, the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the emancipation of women, etc. These are all common examples of moral progress. Well, why does this become a problem for ethical relativism? Well, if ethical relativism is true, think about it. We're not allowed to place a judgment on the moral principles of a different culture. Well, the culture of 150 years ago is a different culture from this one. If it existed today, just in another part of the world, we would say, well, that's a different culture. So, according to moral relativism, it's difficult to understand how we can make those sort of comparative judgments that we make when we talk about things like social progress. So, for those sorts of reasons, many people are led to a rejection of moral relativism. Along with the observation that some of the apparent disagreements between cultures are not that deep. So even in an extreme case such as the case that I mentioned in the last video of the Inuit people's practice of infanticide, when you fully understand the context of the practice of infanticide, the moral objectivist might be sort of making this point. So this is from the perspective of the moral objectivist. Moral objectivist would say, okay, well, you've pointed out this difference that Inuit people practice infanticide under these circumstances, and you say that this is a reason for us to believe that ethical truth is relative to different cultures. But if you examine that practice, it actually seems to be not an expression of a disagreement, but actually the expression of a deeper agreement between cultures. Because why are the Inuit peoples why do the Inuit peoples practice infanticide in those cases? They do it to protect the life of the rest of the group, and the protection of life is a broad, universal, even moral value. It sort of has to be. If your culture doesn't value the protection of life, then the culture would cease to exist. So for all these considerations, the considerations of wanting to retain the ability to judge harshly the obviously immoral actions that can take place in another culture, so for that reason, for the reason that we believe in the existence of social progress, and potentially also for the reason that the apparent disagreements across cultures might be explainable in terms of deeper underlying moral agreements. Many philosophers have rejected relativism and accepted some form of moral objectivism. So, in fact, for the rest of the course, from chapter 4 onward, we are going to be discussing objectivist ethical theories. So that's it for this video. See you guys soon.